spy films weren't always harmless popcorn flicks. Some were considered so dangerous, governments tried to bury them before the public could see too much. These weren't just movies about trench coats and coded messages, they poked holes in the powerful myths of the Cold War. But which films got yanked, banned, or quietly strangled at the box office? Let's pull back the curtain on the spy thrillers that crossed the line and paid the price. The Manchurian Candidate, 1962. Imagine a film so unnerving that it seemed to predict a real-life tragedy. That was John Frankenheimer's The Manchurian Candidate. On the surface, it was a Cold War spy thriller about brainwashing, assassins, and communists pulling the strings. But it wasn't just a thriller, it was a mirror held up to America's deepest paranoia. Frank Sinatra starred as a soldier trying to stop a mind-controlled assassin. But the idea of soldiers turned into programmed killers was more terrifying than Hollywood expected. When the film opened, audiences were shaken, but it was the events of November 1963 that sealed its fate. Just weeks after President Kennedy's assassination, United Artists pulled the film from circulation. The premise of a political figure gunned down by a brainwashed pawn hit far too close to reality. Executives feared public outrage, so the film quietly vanished, not returning to theaters until the late 1970s. During its disappearance, rumors spread like wildfire. Some whispered the government leaned on the studio, worried the movie was too close to the truth about covert operations. Others thought the Kennedy family themselves wanted it gone. No matter the reason, it became a ghost film, spoken about more than seen. By the time it resurfaced, critics hailed it as one of the smartest, most chilling spy movies ever made. Its sharp mix of satire and paranoia still works today because it never really belonged to fiction. It was a story that seemed ripped from classified files, and its censorship only gave it more power. Sometimes burying a movie only makes it more dangerous. The Manchurian Candidate wasn't banned everywhere, but its vanishing act proved how fragile Cold War nerves really were. It showed that sometimes the scariest spy stories aren't about gadgets or car chases, they're about what might already be happening in plain sight. 7 Days in May, 1964. If The Manchurian Candidate rattled the nerves, 7 Days in May downright terrified the establishment. Directed by John Frankenheimer again, this time with Burt Lancaster and Kirk Douglas, the movie dared to imagine something unthinkable: a military coup in the United States. No enemy agents, no foreign plots, just America's own generals deciding they knew better than the president. The story follows a decorated general plotting to overthrow the government because he thinks the president is too soft on communism. Lancaster plays the would-be dictator with chilling authority, while Douglas is the loyal officer who uncovers the plot. The script was so bold that President Kennedy himself reportedly encouraged its production, believing it could serve as a warning against real-life conspiracies within the military. But the Pentagon didn't see it that way. Officials refused to cooperate, denying access to locations and resources. Rumors swirled that top brass quietly pressured theaters and military bases not to screen it. Even allies overseas squirmed, worried the movie suggested Western democracies weren't so stable after all. For a time, 7 Days in May was shadow-censored, not banned outright, but treated like dangerous material that shouldn't spread too far. The irony is, the movie isn't a wild action spectacle. It's a tense political thriller, heavy on conversations, suspicion, and moral dilemmas. Yet that made it scarier. It painted a picture of America's institutions as vulnerable from the inside, something Cold War leaders would rather audiences not dwell on. Over time, the film has gained a reputation as one of the smartest spy-adjacent thrillers of its era, a reminder that sometimes the greatest threat isn't a foreign enemy, but your own guardians of power. 7 Days in May showed what could happen if patriotism warped into dictatorship, and while it never disappeared completely, the quiet efforts to stifle it proved one thing. During the Cold War, Hollywood's imagination could cut closer to reality than anyone was comfortable admitting. The Spy Who Came In from the Cold, 1965. Forget glamorous tuxedos and shaken martinis. This was the spy movie that ripped the mask off espionage and showed the rot beneath. Directed by Martin Ritt and based on John le Carré's bestseller, The Spy Who Came In from the Cold threw audiences into a world where betrayal wasn't the exception, it was the job. Richard Burton plays Alec Leamas, a burnt-out British agent sent on one last assignment that turns out to be a trap. The movie dared to tell audiences that the Cold War wasn't about heroes and villains. Both sides, East and West, were manipulative, ruthless, and willing to burn their own people alive for political advantage. That message didn't sit well with censors. The US military barred it from being shown on overseas bases, arguing it painted Western intelligence as corrupt. In Europe, some governments demanded disclaimers that the story was fictional, fearing it might fuel anti-American sentiment. Meanwhile, in West Germany, officials hesitated, worried the movie undermined the fragile image of NATO unity. For audiences behind the Iron Curtain, it was strictly off-limits. East Germany banned it as capitalist propaganda, while Poland and Czechoslovakia suppressed screenings entirely. Too honest for the West, too critical for the East, this film was radioactive wherever it went. Critics, however, adored it. Burton's performance earned him an Oscar nomination, and the film became one of the defining spy dramas of the decade. But for regular audiences, its reach was strangled. The story's bleak ending, where Leamas realizes he's nothing more than expendable chess pieces in a bigger game, was considered too demoralizing during a time when propaganda demanded optimism. In the end, the spy who came in from the cold proved why Cold War spy films could be more dangerous than battle movies. It wasn't about explosions or shootouts. It was about exposing that both sides of the conflict were playing dirty, and no one wanted the public to see that truth. Torn Curtain, 1966. When Alfred Hitchcock makes a Cold War thriller, you expect clever twists, stylish suspense, and maybe a witty chase scene. But Torn Curtain gave audiences something far more brutal, a murder so real it made censors choke. Paul Newman plays an American scientist faking defection to East Germany, with Julie Andrews as his unsuspecting fiancée. The espionage plot was classic Hitchcock, but it was one sequence that got the scissors moving. In one scene, Newman's character strangles an East German agent with raw, unglamorous violence. It's clumsy, exhausting, and horrifyingly realistic. Hitchcock wanted to show that killing someone wasn't clean or slick, it was messy and brutal. That choice backfired with censors. In the United States, some theaters trimmed the infamous kitchen killing, claiming audiences couldn't stomach it. Overseas, East Germany banned the entire movie as propaganda, while several Eastern Bloc nations followed suit. But it wasn't just the murder that ruffled feathers. The film's portrayal of East German intelligence as both ruthless and bureaucratically incompetent sparked diplomatic complaints. Critics in Eastern Europe blasted it as capitalist lies, while Western critics accused Hitchcock of making a film too cynical for comfort. The production itself was fraught. Hitchcock clashed with Newman and Andrews, and studio executives panicked over its darker tone. Despite its star power and Hitchcock's reputation, Torn Curtain was treated like a problem child. Its box office suffered, and its legacy got buried under Hitchcock's more celebrated works. Still, the film stands as one of the first big Hollywood spy thrillers to openly show the violence of espionage without a glossy finish. Torn Curtain was censored not because of what it suggested about politics, but because it refused to lie about violence. Hitchcock's message was simple. Killing isn't glamorous, it's terrifying. And that was too much truth for censors who preferred their spies to be smooth and bloodless. The Kremlin Letter, 1970. If James Bond was the fantasy of Cold War espionage, the Kremlin Letter was the nightmare. Directed by John Huston, this film ditched gadgets and glamour for a ruthless dive into the underworld of spies who traded in human lives like poker chips. The story followed a team of agents sent on a Showa mission involving blackmail, betrayal, and double crosses that left no one untouched. What shocked audiences and censors was how utterly cynical it was. American intelligence wasn't painted as noble defenders of freedom. They were schemers, liars, and opportunists willing to sacrifice anyone. That didn't sit well with the CIA, who reportedly bristled at the film's release. Whispers circulated that the agency leaned on distributors to keep advertising quiet. Meanwhile, in Europe, countries like Finland and Norway restricted screenings, citing political sensitivity. Even in the US, the film was quietly buried. Critics panned it as too cold, too cruel, and audiences stayed away. Without a studio push, it flopped. But decades later, cinephiles re-examined it and realized what Huston had really done. He made the anti-spy movie. No charm, no patriotism, just a grim chessboard where everyone was disposable. Its failure at the box office wasn't just about audience taste. At the height of Cold War tension, no one wanted a film suggesting that American intelligence looked more like the KGB than the good guys. That idea was simply unmarketable. The Kremlin Letter wasn't just censored by governments, it was sabotaged by silence. The lack of promotion, the whispered warnings, and the international restrictions all worked together to bury it. Today, it's a cult classic, proof that the films Hollywood tries to hide often tell us the most uncomfortable truths. Executive Action, 1973. What happens when a spy thriller dares to suggest America's leaders were targeted by forces inside their own house? That's exactly what Executive Action did, and it's why this film practically vanished the moment it was born. Directed by David Miller and scripted with Dalton Trumbo's fingerprints all over it, the movie dramatized a conspiracy theory that shadowy operatives orchestrated John F. Kennedy's assassination. Not Moscow, not Havana, but insiders, men in suits with too much power and no conscience. On screen, Burt Lancaster and Robert Ryan played cold-eyed strategists, calmly outlining how to eliminate a president they deemed dangerous to the establishment. The film presented its plot with chilling realism, staged accidents, manipulated lone gunmen, and backroom deals. It didn't wink at the audience. It played like a declassified file slipped out by mistake. The reaction was swift. Theaters backed out of bookings. Advertisers wanted nothing to do with it. Some television networks declared they would never broadcast it. Critics split down the middle. Some dismissed it as sensational, while others admitted it was disturbingly plausible. Officially, it was never banned. But when a film is pulled from distribution schedules, denied TV airings, and quietly scrubbed from conversation, that's censorship in practice. For years, Executive Action was a ghost. It limped through a small release, then disappeared until home video gave it new life in the 1980s. By then, conspiracy culture had taken root, and audiences revisiting it were shocked at how blunt it was for 1973. Executive Action didn't need a foreign enemy to scare people. It suggested the spy games could be played in Washington itself, and that made it too radioactive to survive in public view for decades. The Parallax View, 1974. Alan J. Pakula's The Parallax View is one of the most paranoid thrillers ever made, and it was treated like it might be contagious. The movie follows a reporter, played by Warren Beatty, uncovering a corporation that recruits and trains political assassins. Not wild-eyed foreign spies, but cool American professionals working from skyscrapers and boardrooms. It was a nightmare vision of democracy, manipulated from the shadows. The film's most infamous sequence, the testing montage, is a wordless, rapid-fire slideshow of violent and patriotic images designed to brainwash recruits. It stunned audiences and horrified censors. Overseas, some countries demanded the scene be cut entirely, claiming it was psychologically damaging. On U.S. military bases, screenings were forbidden. The Pentagon wasn't about to let soldiers watch a film suggesting that their leaders could be eliminated by invisible puppet masters. For all its brilliance, the movie was suppressed in subtle ways. Distribution was weak. Some theaters mysteriously canceled showings. In Europe, allies like France trimmed it for television, labeling it too destabilizing. Conspiracy theories swirled around the film itself, as if the story it told was playing out behind the scenes of its release. Today, critics call it one of the defining works of 1970s paranoia cinema. But back then, it was treated like a problem film. Too grim, too dangerous, too convincing. Unlike glossy James Bond escapism, the Parallax View whispered that the true assassins wore suits and ties, not trench coats. The Parallax View wasn't erased outright, but the cold reception and censorship abroad ensured it remained in the shadows. Which, fittingly, is exactly where its story says the real power always lives. 3 Days of the Condor, 1975. If the Parallax View was paranoid, 3 Days of the Condor was practically treasonous to the intelligence establishment. Directed by Sidney Pollack and starring Robert Redford, it told the story of a low-level CIA researcher who accidentally uncovers a rogue unit within the agency, plotting global manipulation for oil. Suddenly, the nerdy analyst finds himself hunted by his own people. What rattled officials was how close the movie seemed to reality. Whispers circulated that the screenplay had been vetted by former CIA staff who confirmed its plausibility. The agency itself was reportedly furious, especially after the Watergate scandal had already exposed ugly truths about surveillance and dirty tricks. Distribution faced pressure. Certain theaters dropped it, after warnings about provocative content. Overseas, some allied governments were uneasy. Italy restricted screenings, citing anti-American bias, while France delayed its television debut. In the US, the Pentagon flatly refused to allow it on base theaters. It was, in effect, treated like a threat to morale. Audiences, however, flocked to it. Redford's everyman performance struck a chord, and the film became one of the decade's most successful thrillers. Yet it still carried the stigma of a movie the establishment didn't want you to see. The CIA even issued a statement denouncing its portrayal, which only made it more popular. 3 Days of the Condor proved that sometimes the scariest spy thrillers are the ones where the villain isn't a foreign power, but your own government. The film's shadow censorship only reinforced the message. Maybe the paranoia wasn't paranoia at all. Twilight's Last Gleaming, 1977. Robert Aldrich's Twilight's Last Gleaming wasn't just a thriller, it was a cinematic middle finger to the Pentagon. Burt Lancaster starred as a renegade Air Force general who seizes a nuclear missile silo and threatens to launch unless the US government comes clean about its dirty secrets in Vietnam. Yes, you heard that right. A film that accused America of lying about war and did it with nuclear blackmail as the backdrop. From day one, the military hated it. The Department of Defense refused any cooperation and blasted the film publicly, accusing it of undermining national security. NATO allies like West Germany limited screenings, terrified about inflaming anti-American protests. In the US, the film's distribution was half-hearted at best, with whispers that studio executives had been encouraged to bury it. Box office numbers were dismal, and the movie quickly disappeared. But the content was explosive. Aldrich used split-screen visuals and claustrophobic pacing to make audiences feel like they were trapped inside the nuclear standoff. The film suggested leaders would rather gamble with the planet's survival than admit to lies. That wasn't entertainment, it was heresy. Critics who saw it praised its audacity, but the film's short life in theaters left it largely forgotten. Only years later did cinephiles recognize it as a daring piece of Cold War cinema, one that questioned the very foundation of America's post-war authority. Twilight's Last Gleaming wasn't just censored, it was suffocated. And that made sense, because it dared to ask the question no Cold War government wanted to hear. What if the real threat isn't Moscow, but Washington's own lies? Winter Kills, 1979. Talk about a cursed production. Winter Kills, directed by William Richard, was a dark satire about a Kennedy-style assassination cover-up. Based on Richard Condon's novel, it painted America as a country run by shadowy cabals, corporate interests, and intelligence fixers. Jeff Bridges played the son of a slain president who discovers layers of conspiracy so deep they make the Manchurian Candidate look like child's play. But the story wasn't the only thing conspiratorial. The production itself was riddled with sabotage. Financiers mysteriously pulled funding mid-shoot, forcing the movie to shut down. When it finally limped into release, theaters canceled showings without explanation. Distributors lost interest, and the film was withdrawn just weeks later. Some suspected intelligence-linked corporations leaned on the project, treating it as dangerous fiction that hit too close to reality. Overseas, censorship was explicit. Several European countries refused to import it, labeling it destabilizing. In the US, there was no outright ban, just a wall of silence that ensured hardly anyone could see it. For decades, it was nearly impossible to find until a restoration in the early 2000s revived its reputation. Today, critics call it one of the boldest political films of the era, a lost gem that painted America as a democracy in name only. But back then, it was treated like toxic material nobody wanted near. Winter Kills showed that sometimes the story of a film's suppression is as chilling as the movie itself. It wasn't just censored on screen, it was sabotaged behind the curtain, like the very conspiracies it dared to portray. Rollover, 1981. Who knew a financial thriller could be considered too dangerous for theaters? Alan J. Pakula's Rollover, starring Jane Fonda and Chris Christopherson, turned international banking into a Cold War weapon. The film suggested that oil money, Wall Street, and global finance were all tied into a conspiracy that could collapse the American economy. It wasn't a gun and gadget spy film, it was scarier. It said the real spy game was economic. Middle Eastern governments, particularly Saudi Arabia, were furious. Reports circulated that Saudi officials directly lobbied to block its distribution in the region. In the US, television networks steered clear, refusing to air it for fear of offending oil allies. Critics mocked it as a paranoid fantasy, but buried beneath the Hollywood drama was a dangerous idea, that America's economic stability could be manipulated like a pawn in global espionage. Unlike thrillers that glamorized cloak and dagger missions, Rollover replaced bullets with balance sheets and showed how fragile global power really was. That message was so unsettling that the film was practically blacklisted from serious discussion. It opened in theaters, vanished quickly, and was rarely screened again. Today, it plays like a prophetic warning about how economics, politics, and espionage overlap. But in 1981, nobody wanted to hear it. Hollywood could joke about missiles and bombs, but hinting that the American financial system itself could implode? That was a bridge too far. Rollover wasn't flashy, but its censorship proved one thing: during the Cold War, suggesting that money was as dangerous as missiles could get a film buried faster than any shootout. The Little Drummer Girl, 1984. Based on John le Carré's novel, The Little Drummer Girl was George Roy Hill's attempt to show espionage through the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Diane Keaton played an actress manipulated into becoming an undercover agent, torn between loyalty, love, and politics. It was an unusually raw portrayal of Cold War proxy battles in the Middle East, and governments hated it. Even before its release, pressure groups lined up to kill it. Pro-Israeli advocates called it propaganda, while Arab governments labeled it hostile. Several Middle Eastern nations banned it outright, refusing to let it screen within their borders. In the US, it faced boycotts and harsh criticism, which strangled its distribution. Audiences barely noticed it came and went. The film itself was no box office powerhouse, but its treatment showed how sensitive Cold War cinema could be when it strayed into real-world conflicts. Hill tried to make an intelligent thriller about the moral compromises of espionage, but critics dismissed it as muddled. That dismissal, combined with political backlash, guaranteed it sank like a stone. Decades later, the story was remade as a TV miniseries, proving its themes still carried weight. But the original film remains a curiosity, famous more for who tried to stop it than for what was on screen. The Little Drummer Girl proved that Cold War censorship wasn't always about Moscow or Washington. Sometimes it was about proxy wars and the political minefields Hollywood was too scared to cross. Cold War spy films weren't just entertainment, they were live grenades. Some got banned, some were censored, and others simply vanished into silence. But every time a movie was pulled, it proved how powerful stories can be when they hit too close to the truth. Which of these forgotten thrillers do you think deserves a revival? Drop your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories Hollywood tried to erase.